Okay, guys. Thank you. Welcome.
That sounded like someone got the record button.
Yeah, I see it.
We're good to go.
All right, David, why don't we bring up the first screen in the PowerPoint? And certainly you all are welcome to share the PowerPoint as well. It's pretty dense in terms of copy, so it might be easier to read if you actually have a copy for reference rather than taken off the screen in the recording.
All right, let me.
Yes, I've got a copy, so if you want it, I'll send it to you.
And while we're getting, okay, David's coming online with a PowerPoint.
All right, can you guys see it?
Yeah. It's coming through now.
Guys can see it okay?
Not yet.
Yeah, it's just your name.
Let me share my screen.
Okay, oh, hang on. Yep, we can see it. We've got it. Yep.
Awesome.
All right, and just before we get started, to take a minute, since you did not connect with Larry to get an update on the legal case that's in process, I can just give you a 2-minute update. Basically, on Friday, we filed an appeal to the judge's ruling, to the judge's decisions, basically in general to the judge's decisions, because our position is the judge incorrectly interpreted the law and did not correctly follow the mandates in the legislation that followed the JFK Records Act. So we have appealed the judge's ruling. Obviously, all these things are a long-term process, and that appeal can be in place for months before there is a ruling. In conjunction with that, however, if you've been following the case, you know that the judge did authorize, or if not authorize, not rule against us in the issues of destroyed and missing records. And we are pursuing legal action in regard to destroyed and legal records, which he's given us the right to do. And that's about all that I can say about that, but that is an opening that's still offered to us. And that allows us to do a variety of things, talking to people and pursuing materials that we can identify to the court as missing and destroyed, which we're in the process of doing. So that's a quick update. Larry, I'm sure, would have gone into more length, but that's where we are. And the case is still live. It's in process, and there are still months and months to go in the legal action. So turning back from current events to Mexico City and the Mexico City saga, what David and I are trying to do in this presentation, certainly we're not going to offer a single answer to the questions and mystery about Lee Harvey Oswald in Mexico City. What we really want to do is review for you some of the context, some of the issues of consistency in regard to Oswald in Mexico City, and a number of the issues regarding that appearance in Mexico City that actually have nothing to do with Lee Harvey Oswald, but have everything to do with the CIA and its Mexico City station and its headquarters. So that will be the line of inquiry that we're pursuing. We'll talk about the saga, and what we're going to try to do is introduce some material that, quite frankly, doesn't get discussed much, because all the questions and discussions tend to be about, was he there or was he not there, etc. We're going to kind of go a different direction with this presentation and focus on context, consistency of activities, and issues, basically. So let's start in and go with the next slide. Part of the context that's very important and that doesn't get discussed a lot at all is in regard to Oswald and Marina and their return to Russia. For whatever reason, Marina gets discussed a lot about being pressured about not going back to Russia. It's like a threat that were going to threaten her to say the right things by making her afraid that she might be returned to Russia if she doesn't cooperate. The point is, actually, for context, both Marina and Lee Oswald had been very much involved in returning to Russia throughout 1963. It has to be pointed out that Marina had never renounced her Russian citizenship. As a matter of fact, she had gone through a lot of effort to maintain her Russian citizenship in the US. She had never taken any actions towards American citizenship. She had routinely submitted change of address forms to the Soviet consulate in New York City as it was mandated if she wanted to maintain citizenship. She'd carried out regular correspondence herself with the Soviet consulate on some 15 different occasions, beginning as soon as they arrived in the United States in July 1962. Oswald himself, although for about a period of 6 months, was not actively in communication with Russians. By December, he actually had started sending a note, a message, a holiday greeting to the Soviet consul. Very friendly, again, reaching out, not at all in the same tone that he had used when he left the Soviet Union. As early as February 1963, Marina had formally requested aid in returning to what she described as her homeland in the letter with her daughter. It should be pointed out that June did not hold Russian citizenship, but Marina would have been able to apply for Russian citizenship for her. The law as it read in 1962-63 was no person born in the Soviet Union automatically had citizenship. They had to apply for it. It was a routine process that parents went through, but it was open. And the Soviet Union issued citizenship to a number of people, lots of people over time. Should also be pointed out that before Oswald, during the period in which Oswald was leaving the Soviet Union, he had actually been offered citizenship. He declined that offer, but as during his departure, they had actually responded to his earlier appeal for citizenship and made him an offer, which Oswald may well have considered was still standing. In any event, Marina's initial letter had gotten a response. The embassy told her that she had to formally apply, and when she did, and that she completed all the paperwork with a formal application to return, it would take 5 to 6 months processing. She responded by completing a fairly extensive questionnaire, providing detailed information on her reasons for return, and did this as of July, advised the Soviets that she was pregnant and asked for urgent consideration for her appeal as of July. She urgently wished to be back in the Soviet Union at the time her new child was going to be born. So that's just a bit of context that often doesn't get discussed. Let's go on to the next slide. In response to her letter, the consulate advised her that her request had been accepted and had been forwarded to Moscow. Oswald had attached a note to her letter saying that his return was a separate issue. Marina returning was not necessarily involving Oswald. He realized that that would have to be considered separately, and so that's not what she was requesting. She was requesting a return for her and her children on her own. In August, Marina received another response indicating that her request was being forwarded to Moscow, but still, because of bureaucratic processing, it would be 5 to 6 months before she heard. So it was clear that the new baby would be born in the United States. On November 1st, Marina sent another change of address to the Soviet consulate, restating her intent to return apologizing for not providing more details, listing the problems that she was having in the US finding work, and stating that she knew she would be able to find work in the Soviet Union because of her training, and that was one of the reasons that she wanted to return. On November 9th, Oswald followed that up with another note of his own, explaining his attempt to speed things up by going to Mexico City, appealing to the Russian embassy in Mexico City, and essentially an apologetic letter saying he was really trying to help by speeding up the process, but it just hadn't worked. Okay, what else was going on in 1963? If Marina was writing the Soviets about returning to Russia, Oswald was making a turn towards Cuba. We know historically that Oswald had been interested in Cuba and the revolution all the way back to his time in the Marines. While he was in California, he had talked with a friend of his named Delgado about going to Cuba, both of them going, join in the Cuban Revolution in Central America, carrying that forward. He'd contacted the Cuban consulate in Los Angeles. But as it turned out, he ended up in Russia instead at that point in time. Back in the US, the other thing we know for sure is things did not go in the United States the way Oswald had expected they would. We know from Oswald himself in his own writing that he expected that when he returned, he would get a lot of media attention for having given up the Soviet Union for the US. He expected to be contacted by the media when he landed in New York. He even prepared public response answers to the questions he anticipated. That did not happen. The media didn't contact him when he got back to the Dallas-Fort Worth area. He didn't get the attention that he thought that he would get. And what he got during the next 6 months or so, the next 8 months or so, he didn't get the jobs he thought he was qualified for. He got nothing but manual labor. Even when he got to doing the photographic work, which enthused him for a while, that didn't pan out long term. By the spring of 1963, he was facing the fact that it was increasingly hard to get a job. One of the things that doesn't often get discussed is that he was turned down for numerous jobs for two reasons. He didn't have good references. He couldn't get any good references. Even when he tried to apply for jobs after Jagger-Stovall, he didn't get personal recommendations from the people at Jagger-Stovall. He also had to face the fact that his discharge from the Marines was not an honorary discharge, which was a real killer in terms of getting a job. So he consistently had to lie about those things on his resumes when applying for jobs. And it was getting to be very frustrating by the time he was in New Orleans. So he started devoting more of his time to his thoughts about Cuba. As early as March in Dallas, he wrote the Fair Play for Cuba and committee, and he began leafleting in downtown Dallas, unsuccessfully in his first occasion, but there's every evidence that he did go to downtown Dallas with leaflets, started passing them out, and essentially ran away when the police showed up. Marina herself said by the time they got to New Orleans, Oswald was all about getting to Cuba. Cuba was essentially his fixation. And along with that, in terms of consistency, there are every signs that Oswald was intending to travel somewhere because he actually obtained a new passport in June of 1963. All right, moving onward. But there's some problems in all of this. Oswald, we know Oswald again from the record, was reading and writing a lot in the spring of 1963. We know what publications he was reading. We know what contents of those publications. A lot of it was about Cuba. We know, as a matter of fact, that there's every evidence that Oswald himself had started writing letters to the editor at those publications. David turned up a fascinating letter to the editor, News from Dallas, which is written, it doesn't have his full name attached to it, but you can tell from the contents it's consistent with everything else he's writing on his own at that point in time. But the problem was, when he had contacted the Fair Play for Cuba Committee, he had wanted to start a chapter in New Orleans. And they wrote him back saying that that was a bad thing to do. They did not recommend it. If anything, it might present problems for the organization because New Orleans was a hotbed of anti-Castro activity, and he could get into real problems if he became visible trying to start a chapter. The interesting thing is, while Oswald would continue writing some 4 letters to the head of the FPCC during the summer of 1963, he never got any other responses. So officially, Oswald essentially been told, don't cause us problems by trying to start a chapter in New Orleans, which is actually what Oswald went ahead and started to do. But he did not make that clear to the FPCC. One of the reasons that's interesting is, if the FPCC had endorsed Oswald's travel, he had gotten a letter from them, he could well have used that letter to go to Mexico City and get admitted to Cuba. Because one of the things that was in play is Cuba was honoring recommendations from the FPCC for entry. And several American students in particular, that was a known way. It's something that was generally discussed, was you could get into Cuba with FPCC endorsement. Oswald's problem was, if he really started telling the FPC what he was doing and showing them what he was doing to convince them, they might not have been excited since they had recommended he not do that. Let's go on then and see what happens in terms of consistency with Oswald in Mexico City. Oswald's whole stated purpose for showing up at the Cuban and Russian embassies was to get a transit visa, which will allow him to go to Cuba, to bring his wife and family in furtherance of his efforts to get back to Russia. He didn't request for asylum in Cuba. He didn't request, basically everything he said at the Cuban and Russian embassies was in conjunction with getting his family back to Russia. The interesting thing is that he had actually consolidated the things that he did in New Orleans that summer into a sort of resume. And we know that he took numerous letters, written materials, pamphlets, newspaper articles along with him as a resume to show, and showed both the Cubans and the Russians how much he was in support of the Cuban cause. Now, if he had just had a letter from the FPCC, he wouldn't have needed that. The other thing that he could have had was a letter from Communist Party USA, who Oswald had also been writing. Either the FPC, an FPC endorsement, or a Communist Party endorsement could have gained him entry to Cuba with no challenge. He didn't ask for that from either organization, which, quite frankly, considering that Oswald knew his mail was being monitored and had protested his mail being opened and monitored before that, he might not have felt that was a very bright thing to do because, as we all know, travel to Cuba by an American citizen was illegal. The passport that he'd received in June stated clearly that it was not for use in travel to Cuba. So he did have issues. This is trying to get in this way. There are issues. Can't ask for the FPC support, probably doesn't dare to ask Communist Party for support. But interestingly enough, when he showed up, he was asked, do you have an endorsement? And afterward effect, Sylvia Duran who was the secretary, said that she was somewhat surprised that he had all this essentially resume type material that he brought with him, but he didn't have the things that would have actually gotten him into Cuba with no problem. So essentially, he's not going to get into Cuba unless Cuba can verify, the consulate can verify that he has permission to travel to Russia, which he did. It's another thing he didn't show up with. He's got nothing from the Russians to endorse just a transit visa, which would have been a limited time in Cuba. So what follows next? Okay, moving on. So Oswald, okay, the Cubans told him he's got to have some sort of Russian endorsement. If the Russians will tell us you're good, we'll go ahead and process your paperwork. And, so he goes to the Russian embassy that same day. He shows up at the Cuban consulate, essentially goes through this dialogue with Duran. She says, I'm sorry, you don't have anything really that I can accept. The Russians have got to give us verifications. He goes to the Russian embassy, goes through the same routine with the Russians. Essentially, I'm trying to get to Cuba in an effort to help get my wife, and family back to Russia. The Russians go, okay, fine. Have you done the paperwork? Oswald says, yeah, we've done the paperwork. It's, and so they call and contact their embassy in the U.S., and their embassy in the U.S. tells them, hey, yeah, they're in contact with us. We're reviewing their material, but it's going to be 5 to 8 months. We already told them that. So that's what they told Oswald, and Oswald just kind of walks out the door at that point in time. It hasn't worked. Okay. Goes back and in classic Oswald style at the Cuban embassy says, okay, they're good with it. We're fine. No problems at all. They assured me that we would be good. And so we can go ahead and do the paperwork, right? And Duran says, no, I need, you didn't bring anything with you. I don't have any paper. And Duran at that point in time does something very unusual. She could have just sent him out the door. But because Oswald has made such a case and brought so much stuff with him, seems so sincere, she actually calls the Russians and says, there's an American here. Was he just there? He says he has approval to go. The Russians said, yeah, he was here. Okay. So the Russians say, yeah, there was an American here, and he's trying to get back, but we can't authorize it. The paperwork hasn't processed yet. It's going to be some months. And Duran hangs up the phone and tells that to Oswald. Oswald doesn't like that. So Oswald goes into typical Oswald mode whenever he's faced with opposition that he doesn't like, as he starts arguing. And at that point, Duran calls her boss in. Oswald starts arguing about Cuban bureaucracy. They've abandoned all their principles from the revolution. Okay. And he gets kicked out of the building, essentially. And it's done. Okay, certainly it's done from the Cuban standpoint. Okay, an interesting thing happens here, which triggers the entire mystery about the Oswald saga in Mexico City. If this had not happened, the CIA very likely, the whole issue might have died at that point in time. But what happens next, let's go on, is the issue of impersonation. What the CIA station does at that point in time is, and we know this is going to happen, there's an American visiting the Cubans who wants to get into Cuba. It's illegal for an American to travel to Cuba. That's illegal. Both the CIA and the FBI have been monitoring it ever since that administration directive was passed. But the interesting thing that happens next, that's on the record, okay, is that we have a transcript of a telephone call made on Saturday by supposedly Duran and Oswald, Oswald's name is not yet mentioned. This is very interesting. Everybody knows Oswald by that point in time at the Russian-Cuban embassy, but the woman caller does not mention his name and says essentially, oh, he's back here to get his paperwork done and processed, and all we need is his address. But he doesn't have his address. Well, he didn't give his address to you, so we can't complete this whole process. The dialogue goes on for a little bit. The Russians say, yeah, we know he was here. He was here today. He was here this morning. Send him back over. Give us the address. It'll be okay. Of course, that never happens. And that telephone call is on record. The problem being is that it's Saturday. The Cuban consulate is closed. The Russian consulate or embassy is closed. And later on, Sylvia Duran will swear that she never made that telephone call. Unfortunately, Oswald never lives to be asked about any of this. So that transcript goes into the record at some point in time. That's going to be less than clear as to when it was, but there is little doubt that that call was an impersonation. We'll get into that. But there is another call that occurs. The final call will be made and go on record the following Tuesday. At that point in time, things get really interesting because that is the first point in time where the official CIA record shows the name Oswald being used. The person calling the Russian embassy says, look, I was there earlier. I tried to get some help. And this call really goes somewhere the other calls haven't done. The caller uses his name, says he's Lee Harvey Oswald, says that he feels threatened. He's being pressured in the United States. He and his family are being harassed. He desperately needs help just to stay out of the United States. And as a matter of fact, he needs money. This call is not about even going to Cuba. This call is about Oswald pleading with the Russians that he's threatened. Can they help him do whatever it takes not to go back to the United States? There's no response. Nobody's going to buy into this. But that's what the call apparently says. The problem that starts to appear at this point in time is the translators that do the translations of these calls are on record as having heard that conversation and doing a transcript of that call. David Phillips, in testimony to the HSCA, said, yeah, I heard Oswald saying he was under threat and appealed for help from the Russians. Problem we have is we have no transcript that includes that dialogue. And this is where things really implode, because the sequence of calls and transcripts of the contacts between Oswald and the Russians is just totally screwed up and is never resolved. It was not resolved by the Warren Commission, who avoided the whole issue. It was not resolved by the House HSCA, who did a lot of good things, but whose questioning on these issues was not all that great. They did manage to interview the Tarasovs about these calls and get their descriptions, but they were never able to sync the calls to the transcripts and actually made no effort to do so. They didn't show transcripts to the Tarasovs and say, did you, is this what you did? Did you write this? They just ask a lot of questions. And if you really dig into it, like David and I and others have done, what you'll find is that it's simply a mess. We can't resolve anything from these purported conversations other than the fact, and let's go to the next slide, that Oswald was impersonated. Whether or not he was impersonated in person relies on a lot of issues of descriptions given after the fact as to the appearance of the person, issues of the photo that was submitted with his application for travel to Cuba, which does show Oswald. And by the way, yes, that photo was investigated both by the FBI and by the HSCA. The photo does show clothing that was owned by Oswald. The photo itself was not identified by Marina, but in addition to the sweater being found in his possessions in Dallas, she said, "Oh yeah, I've seen Oswald wear that before." There's some other issues about the impersonation in person. One of the issues about the impersonation in person is the CIA had done that sort of thing before. The CIA had sent its people into the Cuban embassy to gain information from the Cubans about their practices, just basically general intelligence collection. It was something the CIA had done before. But when they did it, they used people that were prepared to do it. For example, they used Jose Casas, who was an AMOT, a member of the Cuban Intelligence Service, operating out of JM Wave in Mexico City. He had been dispatched by a Miami station and had penetrated the Cuban consulate and actually managed to get into some extended discussion with Askew, the same person who had kicked Oswald out of the building. So one of the questions that argues against an in-person assignment for Oswald, if you will, is that the CIA was already doing this, doing it well, doing it successfully, and what Oswald had done makes absolutely no sense in terms of some sort of a penetration mission, which had already been ongoing using actual CIA sources who were prepared for it. The Cubans were suspicious of any American just showing up. So if you wanted to send anybody in and do the job correctly, it should have been a Cuban, and a Cuban who had connections in Cuba, who could use names that were the appropriate names and be successful. And that was not Oswald. That argues against an in-person impersonation, just as the information from the telephone calls on Saturday, everything about the telephone calls argues for an actual impersonation of some sort. So we got two conflicting things going. Yeah, there was an impersonation, almost certainly by telephone, probably less certainly in person. So let's proceed with that. And here's where context becomes very important in judging this whole thing as an Oswald essentially trying to penetrate the consulate, get into Cuba as a CIA asset. And that has to do with an operation that was already in place between the FBI and the CIA, utilizing the extensive electronic surveillance of both the Cuban and Russian embassies. And this is something that we only learned about a relatively few years ago and is not, again, not part of most of the writing about the Oswald saga. And that is that earlier in 1963, a combination of CIA and FBI reaction to an American visitor to the Cuban embassy had occurred. So we know exactly what happened when that occurred. We have the record of it. It ended up with the American being arrested. And it gives us some context because in looking at that incident, we can see what really should have happened. And this is a key to what happened with Oswald versus what the CIA would normally have done and what should have happened in the end if an American just walked into the Cuban embassy. And one of the things that we know was standard when that happened is something called a pretext call. Have any of you, I'll ask for a show of hands, has anybody ever heard of a CIA pretext call having been made in conjunction with Oswald in Mexico City? No, nobody raised their hands. Okay. You haven't heard about it, and I do not understand why, because that was a major issue raised when the HSCA investigated this years later. they actually went through at length, and you can find it in their questioning, the process of what was supposed to happen when an American visited the U.S. Embassy, because the Cuban Embassy, because what the CIA had told the Warren Commission and what the CIA was telling the HSC at first was, we don't spy on Americans. We don't, like, Americans are free to do whatever they want to. We don't, we don't spy on them. We don't track them. We don't record their activities. That was so insanely wrong that the HSCA is actually on record as writing a citation to the Inspector General of the CIA saying, you people are providing us with false information. We know that's not true. It's in your station records. Yes, you do that. And what the standard practice, and we know this, and actually there's commentary on it in the CIA discussions. We know what you do. If the visitor to the embassy does not identify themselves, and you don't have it, and you haven't captured it by name on your bugs and your taps and whatever, you do a pretext call. You call the Russians and you find out who this person is. And actually, that appears to be a very good candidate for what happened on that Saturday. That a pretext call was made, not by Oswald, not by anybody else but CIA operatives. And it's safe to do it on Saturday. Not only is it standard practice, we know that as soon as the station chief, the CIA station chief, was advised on that first visit of Oswald to the Cuban consulate, on that telephone that picked up Duran's call on the tap, soon as he was advised, he immediately directed that every action be taken that was necessary to identify that American. In other words, he amped it up. The Tarasovs later stated that as of that date, it became one of the hottest items going at the embassy, the American embassy, the CIA station at the American embassy. There, everybody was tasked with finding out who this American was. So I would offer to you to at least consider the fact that it would make absolute sense that on Saturday, that CIA personnel got on their line tap at the Cuban embassy. And just so you know, the way that works is that telephone line is literally tapped directly at the connector, outside connection at the consulate building, to a wire that goes into the CIA safe house, where conversations are monitored, conversations are recorded, and a person can pick up a telephone and make a call as if they were at the Cuban embassy. It would show as the same telephone number as the Cuban embassy. As a matter of fact, it's switching center. Someone who was not Oswald, someone who was not Duran, made that call attempting to elicit the identity as the person who had been at both the Cuban and Russian embassies, because that was a priority concern that had been ordered by the chief of station immediately before that. So just something to cogitate on. Since we know that was standard practice, it was consistent. And the interesting thing about the call, actually, the impersonation call suggests that Oswald himself was being monitored and very possibly was under some sort of surveillance by station staff, which actually he should have been, given what had just occurred, because the call refers to the fact that he had just been at the Russian embassy that morning. And what do we know from the Russians themselves? Yes, a person calling himself Lee Harvey Oswald with all of his credentials, all his paraphernalia, knowing about his wife, knowing about getting back, had shown up, talked to two staff members who happened to be there on a Saturday, and it was not standard protocol for them to even be there, but they had talked to him because he's an American. And I got to tell you, an American showing up at a Russian embassy on Saturday is called a walk-in. I'm sure you've heard that term, but there is no staff officer at an embassy who's not going to pay attention to that, because it's an immediate sign that something of intelligence value might be in play. The Russians confirmed that he was there and talked to them and left. So whoever made this call, if it was not Lee Harvey Oswald who had been there, and there's no sign that it was, considering that he used poor Russian in the call, according to the translators, that person knew that he had just been at the Russian embassy. So there's a serious effort going on already. Radar Oswald is most definitely on the radar at that point in time for the CIA, regardless of what they might have said later. Okay, continuing on. How are we looking for time? I need to know how much.
Yeah,
What time do we have, David?
We've still got plenty of time, Larry.
Okay.
So
let's go.
We've got another 45 minutes.
Oh, okay, good, because we got some really dense slides here. But this might be a good place to start then, if there's time, and take a pause for a couple of questions.
Yeah.
Johnny, do you have a question?
Yeah. Hi, Larry. How you doing? So, do you think Oswald was in Mexico City?
Yes.
Why do you think there was never any photographs emerged of him at Cuban
that goes into what we're just going to talk about in the next slides. The reason we don't have what we should have to prove, I mean, first of all, I mean, there is evidence, if you chose to accept it, material that Oswald brought back from Mexico City, for that matter. His own letter to the embassy saying, or the Russian embassy in New York City, that he'd been there. Marina's testimony that he had been there. Now, you can throw all that out, which we generally do, because we just throw out everything that kind of makes it look like less mysterious. But if you throw all that out, you also have the fact that for 2 months prior to the assassination, all the internal communications within the CIA shows that the CIA themselves absolutely knew that Lee Harvey Oswald had been in Mexico City. Not only did they know that, but it was concerning them because he had met with the Russians. The CIA, again, the CIA for 2 months has all the proof they need to be constantly communicating with headquarters about this issue, and not just headquarters, because they're copying the FBI and they're copying every other agencies. So there's no doubt at that point in time, at least before the assassination, that the CIA had evidence and was convinced that Oswald had been in Mexico City. Where it all blows apart is that suddenly, after the assassination, the story starts to change. I don't know if any of you have ever been. John Newman made an excellent presentation many years ago at a Lancer conference and started going through the correspondence, the cables from Mexico City to CIA headquarters. On Friday night, on Saturday, there is absolutely no doubt that Lee Harvey Oswald had been in Mexico City. We've got photos, we've got tapes, whatever. Then when you start looking at it as of Sunday afternoon, suddenly it's like everything starts to vanish. Everyone starts to waffle. Tapes, what tapes? Those were erased. We don't have any tapes. And we know at that point in time on Sunday, the CIA began to lie about Lee Harvey Oswald in Mexico City for whatever reason. I'm not going to sit here and maintain that I can tell you a single reason that they would begin to lie. But I would offer that you have to take that as a serious concern, that something happened at the time of the assassination that suddenly made Lee Harvey Oswald's actual presence in Mexico City start to go south. And at that point in time, we find things, records that disappear, photos that are never turned in, tapes that are never turned in, transcripts of tapes that never match, things that the Tarasaws, the translators, say that don't match. We even go so far as when the HSCA was trying to resolve it, the one person who should have had all the information in hand about Oswald's presence, because he was in charge of counterintelligence for Mexico City Station, is David Phillips. We find the HSCA turned up a memo saying, and David Phillips is saying, yeah, he was there. You know, he's telling the HSCA that. Now, he would write a bit different story in his book, but you got to remember, also, as of days after the situation, CIA was asserting that Oswald had been there and been paid by the Cubans to kill the president, with the Gilberto Alvarado story. So, you know, we're going to see we have multiple stories, we have multiple issues. We have some people that are trying to make Lee Oswald essentially take him out of the record, change the record. The HSCA found a memo saying, oh, you can't believe anything David Phillips tells you because he just didn't know what was going on. And was totally out of the picture. And the HSCA started looking through the internal memoranda about that time in Mexico City. And the HSCA concluded that the CIA had altered its own routing slips to take people off the routing so that they couldn't be questioned. And for David Phillips, who should have been on every routing slip about that time in Mexico City, was on none of them. So did he actually get taken off, or was David Phillips not privy to something that was happening in regard to Lee Harvey Oswald in Mexico City? So as far as your question, I'll answer your question this way. To me, there's every sign that Lee Harvey Oswald was in Mexico City. There is also every sign that after the assassination, the CIA did everything in its power to obfuscate and deconstruct essentially a good story of what had happened with Lee Oswald in Mexico City. And what we'll go through in the next few slides covers a couple of things. It covers the point that the agency itself was so compartmentalized, it may not have known what was going on with Lee Oswald. It may cover the fact that they found some actual live, very important contemporary operations that had to be protected, and they chose to protect those operations by concealing information about Mexico City and some other things. So that's what we'll move on to. I knew that question was going to come up. It was probably just as well to get it out on the table at this point in time. But so a short answer to your question would have been, yeah, I think so. And I think the reason we don't know and can't prove it has nothing to do with Oswald and everything to do with the CIA. So,
Larry, can I just follow up on Johnny's question there? Was he driven to Mexico City, or do you go with the narrative of the bus journey with the girls and so forth?
I'll answer that by giving the answer essentially that I agree with the HSCA's conclusion. I don't think we know how he got to Mexico City. The problem is that, as we will see in the next few slides, one of the issues is that Mexico City Station had total control over the Mexican Federal Police. The Mexican Federal Police were the ones that originated the bus transfers, basically all the material that the FBI used to document his travel in time came from the Mexicans. And there's a real problem with that, because there's every chance, well, there's not every chance. We know that the CIA Mexico City Station was directly involved with the federal police in covering up information. They had Duran locked up immediately so that no one could interview her. We even have memos from CIA headquarters saying saying two things. You cannot allow her to be interviewed. That would expose things we don't want exposed. And your biggest charter at this point in time, this is immediately following the assassination, is to protect our operation in Mexico City. Whatever you have to do, make sure that what we're doing in Mexico is not exposed. And that's, so to answer your question, my guess is that Oswald, after New Orleans, traveled part by car and part by bus. And I can't tell you which parts where. I think David and I suspect we know who was driving him by car, and that he did go from New Orleans to Dallas by car, that he may well have gone from Dallas to Houston by car, that he possibly went by bus from then on. But I am not comfortable with saying how he either went to or came from Mexico City. I'm comfortable with saying he was there, but the rest is an open question to me.
Larry, have you ever read Mark Lane's Last Word?
Yes, I think I can honestly say I've read everything written about Lee Harvey Oswald in Mexico City at this point in time.
So there's an interesting section in that, because Mark Lane debated David Phillips in mid-1970s.
Yeah.
And
one of the things I have to push back to save time for the rest of this is that anything that was written about Lee Harvey Oswald or anything that was written about Mexico City before, say, 7 or 8 years ago, simply did not have the information that we have now, and which led to a ton of very reasoned speculation. But it doesn't, that the earlier writers simply did not have the resource material we have now. So again, I'm going to be honest and say not that we have not reviewed all that material. As you all know, and probably mentioned, David and I have a book in process on the Oswald puzzle. And our take, literally, I'm sorry to say, I simply got to the point where I couldn't accept a lot of the earlier work because I found it was not current with what the information that we now can confirm from an historical standpoint.
all I was going to say was there was during that debate, Phillips is asked by a member of the audience about Oswald in Mexico City, and Phillips takes his time to answer it, but he in effect says that when the record comes out, you will see that Oswald was never in Mexico City. So that's what Phillips was telling the audience, and Mark Lane obviously writes about it in Last Word. So I'm just wondering if you've heard that before, that's all.
I honestly think he was just wrong. I mean, I hate to be blunt, but you know, when did he write that? When did he write that? I think first of all, I think the evidence will never all come out because of what we have learned in the past. That evidence was either destroyed, not collected, or altered. There's no evidence that's going to come out that is going to prove that he was not in Mexico City. I think the evidence that would have proved that he was in Mexico City is not going to come out either, and that's because that's the CIA's decision.
Thanks, Larry.
So David, see, I know this is what we're going to face, but I guess we should have put that slide up at the very front that says, yes, we have a contrarian view.
I enjoyed your talk on Black Hawk with Jim and Paul Blow recently.
Yeah. You're going to find that we have a lot of contrarian things to say, not just about Mexico City. Mexico City may end up being the least contrarian of it all, but David, you're still there. The good thing is David is still there. He hasn't left me, so we can proceed with the. So, why did I make the statement I just did? Why do I feel so strongly that the CIA acted to actually destroy evidence and to not resolve this issue. Because if you step back about it and think about it, there's nothing wrong, there's nothing inconsistent. Everything about Lee Harvey Oswald being in Mexico City is consistent with just about everything else that's on the record for 1963. Yes, he was trying to get Marina back to Russia. Yes, he was trying to get to Cuba. There's just no reason that he wouldn't have done whatever he could come up with to make that happen. And he knew that it was not working through the US. So what did we see earlier about Lee Harvey Oswald? He's up for long shots. What happened when he got to Russia and they weren't going to let him stay? He slit his wrist. You know, it's not like Lee Harvey Oswald does not take risks. He doesn't play long shots. He doesn't play wild cards. So nothing's inconsistent with his being there. What is inconsistent is the stupidity and the utter ineptness of the CIA's story about his being there. And the HSCA even went so far as saying in the Lopez report and in their summary that the CIA was either one of two things. They were either lying about it for some reason, or they were just totally inept and had made themselves look stupid almost beyond belief. You know, so you're going to have to accept one of those two things. I'm going to come down with, because we know they did know how to handle American visitors to the Russian and Cuban embassy. We know, we have context for that. We know what they should have done. We know what they seem not to have done, or we know what they made disappear. There was, what did they have to protect in Mexico City? What would have been so strong that they would make themselves look so stupid? What did they have to protect? We know that they had an immense, probably the most extensive intelligence collection system in Mexico City than in anywhere in the world. They routinely monitored all American citizens visiting Cuban and Russian facilities with photographs, with cameras, with wiretaps. They routinely monitored all travelers passing through the Mexico City airport with courtesy of the Mexican president and the Mexican federal police. They had unique telephone and wiretap capabilities, which, and here comes the real kicker, if I had to give the committee or the HSCA proof of Oswald, I would have immediately disclosed all of this. I would have disclosed my wiretaps, including the fact that they were running an operation with a dozen or more Mexican military officers staffing a central wiretap center, collecting calls to multiple types of embassies, and all that information was being shared with the Mexican president and other OAS, Organization of American States. This would have been a diplomatic catastrophe, a national security catastrophe for the US. It would have outed the Mexican president, who could very well have lost his office over this. It would have outed several of these other nations, because it would have outed the fact that they were participating in intelligence collections in a neutral country. It would have been a field day for Cuba. It would have been a national security disaster for the US if this information had started surfacing on how Oswald tapes, photos, how it all played in Mexico City. And we know that post-assassination, the memo that was written to headquarters, to the station, was that they had to do everything in their power not to endanger these covert surveillance capabilities. Okay, next. The other thing that we're facing, aside from just, okay, first off, again, how many of you are familiar with the fact that there was a furor over a single photo from Mexico City of someone who had entered the Russian embassy being shown to someone in Dallas. Have you ever seen the FBI correspondence on that? The FBI correspondence is lengthy, page after page of, first, we can't do this. Yeah, we have to do this, but cut everything out of the picture. They are so sensitive to the fact, how did you get a picture from Mexico City? We don't perform surveillance and intelligence collection on our people, on our, you know what? The press will be all over asking the simple question of, how did you get that? And they were right. The press would have been all over an Oswald photo if it had been entered into evidence, or a tape recording of Oswald at the Cuban embassy, if that had been it. But there are issues beyond that. One of the issues where it appears that the CIA was even confusing itself is there were separate practices in play for different players operating in Mexico City, all with the CIA. There were 4 different groups conducting field operations in Mexico City. The station itself, JM Wave out of Miami, with its own substation in Mexico City. The Cuba Project Special Affairs Staff, which is doing operations in Mexico City that nobody was being read into except David Phillips, and this was the AmWorld operation, and Angleton and CIA SIG, counterintelligence. All of those people, we can now clearly show, were doing activities in Mexico City, and they weren't sharing them with each other. Nobody was read into each other's operations. They were all acting independently. So the fact that they could be confused and there could be holes and inconsistencies in records in various places makes total sense. One of the most striking things, and again, something that was not known until only a few years ago, was that Oswald's bio file, his 201 general file at CIA headquarters, was not where it should be. It was held in counterintelligence and not available to everyone else. It was very compartmentalized, and it contained only his Russian experience. Even when he came back to the US and had been in the US for a year, extremely involved in Cuban-related activities, that was in a separate Cuba file. Somebody was screening that out of his general 201 file. So it was compartmentalized. The people that were doing knew of Lee Oswald, and yes, absolutely, the CIA special affairs staff at Miami Station were all over Lee Oswald and aware of his activities. That wasn't showing up in his file. So people who read that file, who were given information out of that file, were being totally misled for whatever purpose, including the Mexico City station, who was not, when they said, oh, this guy Oswald was here, tell us all you can about him, because, we're concerned. They're not getting any information about his prior Cuban activities with the FPCC or in New Orleans or anything else. That's being held from them. The information that was shared with other agencies about his being in Mexico City, which drove Hoover berserk, and later Hoover wrote a memo on a note that says, we can't trust the CIA about anything because they lied to us. They didn't tell the FBI about his Cuban visit to the consulate. All they told them about was the Russians, which actually makes kind of sense because the CIA was working with the FBI on tracking Russian agents that were crossing back and forth from the US to Mexico City. If you've heard of Tumbleweed, that's one example of what was going on there. So the FBI expected to be told, and they were told, but not the whole story. And in the end, what all of this means, and another reason why I think Lee Harvey Oswald was in Mexico City, is Jane Roman, to Newman and Morley, essentially admitted that she was sending paperwork back to Mexico City and to other agencies that she knew was both incomplete and incorrect. And that meant that an operation was going on with Lee Harvey Oswald related to Mexico City. Another reason why I think, yes, he was there. He may not have even known what was going on around him, but I think he was there. David, let's try next. Another thing that we've learned, again, that nobody would have known, that adds confusion to this whole thing. Simpich found this in a record within the last couple of years. And that's that the CIA felt that the FBI in Mexico City was not trusted. They felt that there was a leak in the FBI, most likely in the Mexico City station. And this was really key to this information management because they were trying to figure out who it was. The CIA and FBI had both worked Kostikov and other staff members who were suspected of being Soviet intelligence, which of course they were. I mean, how silly is it? We know that our stations, CIA stations, were undercover as State Department employees. You know, that's the standard cover. So we expect that the people, you know, that there are intelligence officers at our embassies, just as there are intelligence officers at theirs. So there's no big secret about this. And an interesting thing that complicates all of this in terms of compartmentalizing information is this may well explain why the FBI wasn't given the full story, and especially FBI headquarters, and why information that could have been very suspicious about Oswald in terms of a security standpoint with his Cuban contacts was not given to the FBI. The strange thing is, it was not given to the FBI in the United States. Simpich discovered that it was shared with the FBI in Mexico City. So their people, the legat, who's an FBI officer, was informed about Oswald with the Cuban embassy, and everybody in Mexico City knows this, but they're not telling headquarters, is not relaying this information to Hoover and Hoover's seat of government at FBI headquarters. So this is another piece of context that I'm offering that explains why Mexico City and what happened there is so confusing, irrespective of what Oswald may have been doing himself. David, let's go on. And the final thing, and this is another thing, if the CIA was protective of its intelligence operation, its capabilities, its relationship with the Mexican president, which was totally illegal, and it's uncertain how catastrophic it could have been if it were disclosed. The CIA was in, when Oswald was there with Duran, the CIA had an active, very critical dirty tricks operation going on in Mexico City and at the UN, targeting Cuban diplomatic personnel. They were using AMOT resources out of Miami as part of this. They were contacting diplomatic personnel to try to get more information. That was going on irrespective of Oswald, and it had already been going on for months. The whole point of this Dirty Tricks project was to compromise and turn Cuban diplomatic personnel and their spouses. They had been put in play by these AMOTs and JMWA personnel collecting information on who was doing what and who was sleeping with whom. And the first two major operations that came out of it, probably the most significant, was at the time of the assassination and for months afterwards. The CIA thought that it was going to turn a major source of information on at the highest level within the Cuban government. And that was Carlos Lechuga's wife. Not Carlos Lechuga. Carlos Lechuga had been Cuban ambassador in Mexico City. He had had an affair with Sylvia Duran. We now know that Duran's family was aware of it. The CIA was aware of it. Lechuga was compromisable. But when Cuba found out about it, they moved him to New York City and made him the Cuban ambassador at the UN, or delegate at the UN. An extremely valuable intelligence target. The CIA's strategy, though, was not to try to turn him. They were going to communicate with his wife and tell her about this and get her so mad at her husband that she would become a source for them. And he was scheduled to move back to Cuba to a high post within the government. It would have been an intelligence coup. So the strange thing, maybe not strange, but the matter of fact is the people that Oswald was coming into contact with at the Cuban consulate in Mexico City were already targets of a major CIA dirty tricks program that was already in play, which is why the CIA immediately intervened to have Mexico lock up Duran, grill her, possibly even torture her, and why we have a headquarters memo that says we do not want any Americans to confront Duran or be in contact with her, even though we know she was perfectly willing to testify to the Warren Commission and even come to the U.S. to do so. The CIA directly intervened so that Duran was not questioned. It could have resolved all the questions about Oswald. Could have resolved, there's no doubt if she had been allowed to talk to investigators then, we would not be having this dialogue now. Same way with the Tarasaws. If they had sat down and straightened out all the issues with the transcripts and the tapes and the Tarasaws, it would all be clear. It was made unclear by the actions of the CIA. Okay, next.
Larry, if I could just interject here.
Oh, I bet I know what you're gonna say. Go for it, David.
Well, Lechuga was also a target. And believe it or not, we believe that Manolo Rey had Sylvia Odio, yes, that's Sylvia Odio, talk to him and try and put herself in his path as a possible dangle. So that was very interesting. We came out with that.
That was an excellent find by David. I'm sorry I forgot to mention it, but the point being, again, this is something we've only known, I would say, in the last 2 years. And David found the correspondence between Manolo Rey and his CIA officers saying that he had a woman that was in a position to contact Lechuga and essentially suborn him. The implications could be many different things when you use that word, but the point is that she had a viable issue that Lechuga would have to listen to, which of course was the fact that Sylvia Odio's parents, mother and father, were both still imprisoned under harsh terms in Cuba, and with a good possibility that an argument could have been made for their release. Even if she didn't get them out, a lot could be warned. Lechuga was everybody's target, it seems. But it's interesting. David and I have thought that maybe we should really have written a book called The Two Sylvias, but we passed on that. Little humor, you guys are entitled to laugh. It's okay. Okay, next slide, David. So the question is the mystery of Oswald in New Orleans a matter of fact that Oswald wasn't even there? And something was, is that the real reason that we are still left where we are? Or are we left where we are because what the CIA did to protect its operation in Mexico City, protect live and ongoing intelligence operations, is it because the CIA did what they always do, which was protect themselves, even at the risk of making themselves look stupid? And so the Lopez report essentially stated that, as I said earlier. The Lopez report chided the CIA for not cooperating. It expressed its concern that it was being given incomplete and incorrect information, that even the IG had lied to it. It did not accept any of the explanations for the lack of tapes, the altered paperwork, the routing slips, and this is where we list what I mentioned earlier about the CIA memo saying nobody can believe what David Phillips has to say. Well, if you can't believe what David Phillips has to say, obviously we're going to have a mystery, because he's the guy that would have been in charge of any counterintelligence operations using Oswald or about Oswald in Mexico City. So this is kind of where we come down at the end, is I would say, bottom line answer to your question, it appears to us that Oswald was in Mexico City, that he was in Oswald, his behavior in Mexico City was consistent with everything else that had been going up to that point in time, that it was a Hail Mary type last minute effort to get to Mexico, to get to Cuba, that Oswald's actions in both the Cuban and Russian embassies, where he appeared to be almost, scared, stressed, not quite hysterical, but almost, are very consistent with his behaviors from earlier, even initially in the Soviet Union. So we feel that the reason we have the mystery is not due to Oswald, it's due to the CIA and its standard behaviors. And to emphasize that, let's look at what happened next. And that's what happens with Oswald after Mexico City. What do we find in terms of consistency there? Is Oswald, I was just on a spy mission for the United States in Mexico. What do I do next? I'm hysterical because I couldn't get into Cuba. No, what we really see is it's like a reset. Oswald, after Mexico City, what does he do? He's in Dallas. He doesn't even, the first thing he starts doing is hunting for jobs. He stays at YMCA. He starts a job search. He starts contacting people. And after he starts that, then he reestablishes contact with Marina and June at the Pains. But it's like Mexico City did not bother him that much. As at the bottom, we note that Marina said, yeah, he said he had been in Mexico City, but they just refused to have anything to do with him, and it didn't work. Just that simple. Yeah, I went, I tried, didn't work. Okay, now let's go on with things. We're going to write the Soviets again. You're going to send them a letter. I'm going to send them a letter. We're going to keep trying to get you back to Russia, and maybe me too. Oswald applies for several jobs in downtown Dallas, including a job as a photographer. Why? That's actually on record, that he starts his standard thing again, applying for jobs, not getting them. He applied for another job at a photo processing plant. Unfortunately for Oswald, again, he didn't have any references, didn't have any, he lied again on his application in Dallas at that point in time by saying his last job had been in the Marines, because he doesn't have any references. And he doesn't get the job. Why doesn't he get the job? I'm not sure you're familiar with this. We have a document that shows actually they wanted to offer him the job, but he didn't have, at that place, at the photographic place, he had actually given Jaggers as a reference. And they called Jaggers, and the guy at Jaggers said, yeah, he was kind of an odd duck when he was here. Sometimes he had Russian materials. You probably shouldn't hire him. So he didn't get the job. So Oswald is back in Dallas for weeks looking for jobs and not getting them because of the same problems that he had in New Orleans. So it's like a reset. It's like whatever Mexico City was, it wasn't the end all. He's back to corresponding. Next slide. Back to corresponding with the Russian embassy. He's spending time in October at Mrs. Payne's home. She gives him a driving lesson. Okay. Having the same job hunting problems. With his TSBD applications, he lists his Marines, his last job, and claims an honorable job discharge, which is a lie, of course. And he's back to taking the position as he just did at the Russian embassy, that he's being harassed by the FBI. He actually goes to the FBI officer, gives them a letter about harassment, and they destroy it after the assassination. And again, November 9th, as recent as November 9th, before the assassination, he's writing to the Russian embassy, talking about getting Marina back to Russia, him back to Russia, pleading for immediate action based on FBI harassment, just like we saw in Mexico City. And he had something else. He sweetened the pot once again, claiming that the FBI was trying to get Marina to defect. So once again, he's upping the ante. And that's really the last we see of Oswald in Dallas is what I would call a reset. He's back to doing everything that he was before. It's entirely consistent with everything that he had been doing, including in Mexico City. So we have time for questions. Where are we?
Yeah, we've got 5 or 10 minutes for questions.
Okay.
Guys.
And we probably won't please you with any of them.
No, not.
Larry, was the whole point of Mexico City to do with the story of Oswald? You know, to the connection with Cuba and Russia,
Well,
the communist
think,
connection, you know, and just part of the story. And then when after the JFK was shot, they didn't want to use that there because he was a lone gunman. Or was that something to do with it, or not?
All right. I think that the answer to that story is there are two answers, really. What did Mexico City have to do with Oswald? You know, Oswald's view of what was going on. And then and the CIA's view pre-assassination. There's a whole pre-assassination story about Oswald in Mexico City. And then there's a post-assassination story about Oswald in Mexico City, which is confused and disjointed. But the fascinating thing is it's often put into play, you know, the so-called poison pill, you know, his contact with Kostakov is gonna, but the thing is, if you look at what really seriously worried the US government in the 3 to 5 days after the assassination, it was the Gilberto Alvarado story that consumed the president and the director of the CIA. It was Mexico City putting forth what can best be classified as a Class B movie story of Gilberto Alvarado in the Cuban consulate, taking money, being paid to kill President Kennedy. So, quite frankly, the CIA in the form of Mexico City and the U.S. ambassador in Mexico, the chief of station, and David Phillips trying to convince official Washington that Oswald was a paid Cuban assassin, which Kostakov has nothing to do with that issue. They've got a much better story that they're trying to make play. So forget Kostikov and what might or might have been said between Oswald and Kostikov. The Cubans gave the man money. We've got a witness here that saw it happen. He gave us the name of the lady, where she lives, a description of the man. He saw her passport. He knows the exact amount of money that Oswald was being given. He told us what was said in the exchange, that Oswald had guts enough to kill Kennedy. You know, that overlays anything else. And that did indeed, that's, if you look at the communications from at the DC level, that's what got their attention. So that is, yeah, that's part of the Mexico City story, but it's coming entirely from the CIA. And it is the FBI that totally demolishes it within a few days. So I guess it's the strangeness is that the actuality of Mexico City in terms of Oswald gets confused, obstructed, compartmentalized. And what we have instead is a CIA effort based on Alvarado trying to convince the president and everyone else that Oswald was a paid Cuban assassin. So that, to me, that's the story that played, that's the post-assassination story that played out, which is totally fictional. I mean, there's nothing to it. And that's why the FBI was able to deal with it so quickly. It's like, it almost makes me think that it was another part of the CIA's, let's divert attention from what might have been going on to what this story is, because it's so much more sensational. It's not just, oh, Oswald met with a Russian, with Kostikov, and yeah, we know him. It's no, Oswald met with the guys who paid him. And years later, Phillips would even be writing in his book, asserting that that story was absolutely true and that they had proof that Oswald had come back with thousands of dollars in cash to kill the president.
Larry, who do you think put Alvarado up to that? Was it Phillips or somebody within the Mexico City station at the time? What do you think?
Two things. I think the question is, it's been pretty well shown, and Peter Dale Scott did that Alvarado, as an operative of Nicaraguan intelligence, would have been a contact for Phillips. Phillips absolutely would have known that Alvarado, that this story came from an intelligence asset. Now, does that help sell the story? You know, did Phillips have him make up the story, or did Phillips just help him sell the story? I honestly don't know. The story is so stupid that it almost like it underestimates Phillips' capabilities. David Phillips knew how to do good propaganda, and he knew how to do good intelligence work, and this is not it. Surely, and certainly it's not something that could have been planned in advance, because I will swear to you, if the CIA had wanted to actually frame Oswald that way, they would have had photos of Oswald with a Cuban agent. They would have had correspondence, forged correspondence. The case against Oswald would have been solid. We know they did that routinely. They knew how to do those things. That was their day job, and they had the resources to do them. None of that shows up in the Alvarado story. So I almost feel it's kind of like a last minute thing that Phillips put into play to create a diversion, and he sold it, because there's no, again, if you read the details of the story, his boss shouldn't have believed it. You know, somebody should have pushed back down in Mexico City, but no, the whole station got behind it, including the U.S. ambassador. So yeah, I would put it at the feet of Phillips one way or the other, David.
Larry, just could you talk about the FBI agents in Dallas after the assassination listening to a telephone conversation purported to be of Oswald in Mexico City, and concluding that it was not Oswald's voice on the tape?
Yeah. It certainly strikes me that tapes did exist, and the CIA has lied about this. I very well suspect that the tape that came to Downs that had the voice on it was the impersonation tape. It was the call to the Russian embassy, because that's the way it was portrayed. What they were interested in at that point in time, the dialogue between Hoover and Johnson the morning after the assassination, was all about Oswald at the Russian embassy, right? I mean, we know that's what they talked about, and that there had been somebody that had impersonated him. So I have to assume the tape that was sent up was that impersonation call. So I think that's absolutely correct. I think that's true. The question is, did the people that sent that tape up even know who made the impersonation? That may well have been compartmentalized from them. We literally don't know, but I do think that part was true. Yes, there was a phone call to the Russian embassy on tape that was not Oswald.
Thank you.
Anybody else?
Yeah, I mean, Larry, when you talk, there's a couple of bits I'm not really grasping. When you talk about not showing the images and phone calls of Oswald's voice to cover up intelligence sources, surely it's just that it's not Oswald, that there is somebody there because they've got photographs of it. So doesn't that in itself release some of the sources and techniques that they've got, because they've released a photograph that shows somebody? I think that's what I'm probably not getting. Does that make sense?
And I would love to be able to resolve that question. I can't say to my own satisfaction, but here's what I think would be happening. First of all, we're talking about multiple photographs of Oswald, because Oswald was at the Cuban embassy. He was at the Cuban consulate twice. He was at the Russian embassy at least twice. So there should have been multiple images of Oswald at different locations. We're not talking about just one missing picture. We're talking about multiple missing pictures. And David Phillips actually even admitted that fact without saying so, because when the FBI was doing their investigations of some of the leads that they were getting, they were investigating a particular individual that it appeared at the Cuban consulate during the period of time Oswald was there. And they asked for photos. And the CIA didn't send them any photos, of course, because we're not going to show anybody the pictures that have this photo surveillance, even the FBI, by the way. But Phillips wrote back a letter saying that we know this person was not at the embassy, the Cuban consulate then, because we have photos of everybody that entered the Cuban consulate. And this is exactly the same time Oswald is supposed to be at the Cuban consulate. So even David Phillips was aware that they did have those photos. The camera was not broken. So to answer your question, the point is, if I show one photo, which photo would I show? If I show one photo, I really should show all the photos to prove that it works. I do a good job. Here's the photo surveillance of Oswald in Mexico City at both the Cuban and Russian embassies. And here's how we identified him as Oswald. No problem. But if they do that, they have put into evidence. And you remember, this case is going to trial. This Oswald's not dead at this point in time. When those tapes are listened to, when they sent photos up, or should have sent photos up, Oswald's still living. Worst case is that this could go into a trial. It could go in front of the press. It could go to the Warren Commission, who could expose. They don't know how this is going to play out. So they can't share anything with anybody at the risk of content. One photo proves to everybody in the world that the United States is conducting surveillance on American citizens at foreign embassies, which leads to a whole host of questions you don't want to answer. Now, I know that seems trivial to us, because that's not what we're interested in. Those are the sorts of things that are all consuming to the CIA in terms of their activity. They don't care about us. They don't care about Oswald, guilty, innocent, whatever. They care about their day jobs and their career and their activities. That's the best answer I can give you. I don't like it either. That's just the best answer I can give.
So do you think if LBJ then had went along with the scenario that it was a Cuban conspiracy, etc., and that Oswald had killed the president on behalf of Fidel Castro, and basically the American government would then use the assassination of the president as a context or a pretext, sorry, to invade Cuba, do you think then pictures would have surfaced showing Oswald at these consulates?
Well, let me try to wrap my head about that. First of all, the pictures would have done no more than confirm Oswald was in Mexico City. So they could have supported the Alvarado story. Okay, so I agree to that point. If they decided to provide the pictures as part of selling the guilt, here we can confirm Oswald is not lying because we can confirm Oswald was at the consulate. Well, they'd already said that. They were already on record about that. They had already been talking about that for 2 months. So the photos weren't necessary to sell the Alvarado story. The photos were not necessary at that point. Nobody was questioning Oswald having been in Mexico City. That wasn't even an issue. The only issue at play was, did Oswald actually meet with the Cubans, and did the Cubans pay him to kill the president? I don't think the photos would have done anything to support that, because nobody questioned him. You would have had to have, an intercept of that conversation from inside the Cuban consulate to support Alvarado's story, which they didn't have. They did not have that area of the Cuban consulate bugged. They had telephone lines tapped, and on occasion they had telephone lines and offices bugged, not at that particular time, but they didn't have anything to support the Alvarado story, which is why it collapsed so quickly. But no, I guess what I'm trying to get out of all of that is, even though the decision was made on Sunday morning that none of this was really going to be pursued. Okay, Oswald is going to be Oswald and Oswald alone. We know that. We know that's what when Hoover told it, gave orders that there will be our investigation is complete, write it up. It was Oswald, it was nobody else. Everything else is kind of, what's the right word? It's collateral. It happened, it muddies up the waters, but there was never any chance. If they had, I will guarantee at this point in time, I'm firmly convinced, if they had proof of the Alvarado story, we would never have seen it, because it was not going to be anybody other than Oswald, and Cuba and Russia were not going to be involved. We know that to the extent that we actually have a letter written from Hoover to Johnson, along with the FBI report, saying that Hoover wanted to hold open the issue of a Cuban conspiracy. He had leads suggesting that Castro had paid Oswald, and he wanted to pursue them, so he did not want the FBI report to reject totally the idea of conspiracy. And Johnson just totally ignored that letter. It was not going to play. Wouldn't have mattered who had what. I don't know that really answered your question, but that's the best I can give you.
Thanks, Larry.
Larry, why would they spend the time saying that Oswald was going to the embassy, but then provide a photograph of somebody completely different, and then they not have the tapes and all this sort of thing, instead of just, if he was there, just having a photograph of him?
Well, I guess I'm failing to get across the point is a single photograph that is entered into evidence somewhere exposes what the CIA was doing in Mexico City. That's why they would not want to share info. I agree with you. In one sense, it makes no sense to me. Why doesn't the CIA just call in Duran, give her the Warren Commission, resolve all these questions? Was that the real? Is this the guy that you saw? They don't. That makes no sense. That makes even less sense than providing pictures that they have showing Oswald in Mexico City, which we all know that there is some side proof of Angleton going to Mexico City and literally going into man's safe and literally removing evidence about Oswald in Mexico City. We know that for absolute certain. There's no reason for Angleton to have gone to Mexico unless there was something for him to get that was expose his operations, expose something that might show up eventually, when the safe's cleaned out, personnel records get you, oh, look at this. So I'm not saying it makes no sense to me. All of these questions could have been resolved early on with tapes, photos, testimony. The CIA chose not to do so. And I think choosing not to do so made them look suspicious. Why would they do that? They had to figure that something Oswald being in Mexico City, they've been telling everybody for 2 months he was there. Why not just go with it? But that's not what they chose to do. So I don't think they were lying to themselves for 2 months. I think there was after the assassination, other decisions were made. We've got to suppress this information that we have to protect our operations.
Did Hardway and Lopez conclude that Oswald had visited the consulates?
I'm sorry, I didn't catch that.
I said, did Hardway and Lopez of the HSCA conclude that Oswald had been at the consulates?
They accepted that he had been at the consulate, yes. Their basic conclusion was, we conclude that Oswald was at the embassies, he was at the diplomatic facilities, but aren't comfortable with concluding anything beyond that fact. We're not happy with the trip records. We're not, as far as the overall trip and journey and appearance, we're not comfortable with those. We can't reach a conclusion. However, they did include that he was at the diplomatic facilities. And that is in the record. David, I've left David out of all this.
Thank God.
Yeah.
Boyce is kind of going.
I didn't see him raising his hand or leaping forward to join in the conversation, but okay, okay, go ahead.
Okay, well, I think we probably have to wrap it up now, Larry, because it's been a long weekend. So
Thank you, Larry.
About a year or so ago, I think you were on one of the podcasts and you were saying that your Oswald contrarian monograph was about 150 pages. You seem to be continuing your
It got more
dive.
contrary. It got more contrary as time went on, and it involved in what will probably be about a 250-page book,
Right.
which has been written. We're editing now. It certainly should be published this year. And I guess I need to offer it. Just what we have done is we have revisited Lee Harvey Oswald with all that we know now, which is light years beyond what was available to the first researchers. So I'm not trying to put them in a bad light, or the bottom, when I'm basically, David knows in this book, I'm recanting a lot of things that I wrote and someone who would have taught that I wrote earlier about Oswald, because I was simply repeating information and hadn't done, well, even in 2006, we didn't have the information we have now. When I first wrote, someone would have taught. Yeah. So this is just a new dive into the subject of Oswald. We may have dived over our heads for sure, but yes, it's more contrary and it's definitely longer and it is book length. So For what it's worth, that's what it is.
Do you, so just a quick question then, do you comment on how Oswald funded his trip to the Soviet Union and how he got back in the State Department?
Yeah.
Are you saying that
length.
none of this is nefarious, it's legitimate? Can you quickly touch on that?
None of it is nefarious. It's the measures that we use for this are consistency and multiple sources. You know, it's sort of like you can look at things. Is Oswald's behavior from one point in time consistent? Is his personality consistent? Is his character consistent? And as it turns out, it is. And the one thing that is consistent about his personality that I would deny anyone to refute is that Oswald ever willingly took orders from anybody. If there was an ultimate contrarian, it always was Oswald. The concept that someone would be consistently giving Oswald detailed orders to do different things, to move from one project to another, just does not play with the Oswald that history gives us.
Is the constant resetting as well, presumably, of his life? Yeah.
Oswald resets himself. I'm glad you brought up that word. Oswald constantly resets and replays himself. He doesn't change over time. In fact, Marina's real problem with Oswald is that on occasion, like when Oswald was courting her in Russia, you know, for a period of like only 2 or 3 weeks, he's the best boyfriend in the world. I mean, he's attentive. He's he's great. And then they're engaged, and within like weeks after their marriage, he reset himself to his own irritable personality. And she's going, "Oh, the guy that I married is not the guy that I dated." Well, yeah, right.
That happens a lot though, Larry.
He wasn't. And by the way, how many men in the world fit that model, right?
Yeah,
okay,
exactly.
You think Oswald?
So actually, on that note, very quickly, do you think Marina was a spy, or it was some kind of honey trap going on then back in the day, given Robert Webster, for example, as well?
Certainly, I don't think she was a spy. I think we know that she actively dated foreigners. There's every reason to feel that if the Soviet GRU, or if the intelligence service had asked her about who she was dating, and you know okay, fine, so she would have told them. I think but the problem, and I encourage everybody to read Ernst Titovit's book on Oswald in Russia, is Soviet intelligence already had Oswald's apartment bugged. They had informants all over the place. Multiple girls that he dated were informants already, even before he met Marina. They knew everything there was to know about Oswald. I'm not even sure they went to the trouble of asking Marina. One of the reasons I think that is they gave Marina hell over trying to leave Russia with Oswald. And Newman's done this. If you look into the paperwork, for over a year, they harassed Marina at work. They removed her memberships. They literally did everything that they could to break this up, which does not argue for, oh, we're sending her as a spy. It just doesn't look like that at all. It looks like she was a young woman who thought Oswald was really interesting and attractive because they're foreigner, and gee, it would be great to live in the United States. And she gets to the United States, and this guy doesn't even have a car and doesn't even want a car. Like, who cares? I'm going back to Russia. I'm sorry, that was a slight exaggeration, but
yeah, well, it could be right. She bet on the wrong horse, basically.
She got the wrong boyfriend, I think.
If it was economic, well, it'd be really interesting, I think, with all this contrarian perspective now that you've got, how that reconciles with Oswald being set up as a patsy. I guess you will touch on that.
This is all David's. The last half of the book is our view of how Oswald was set up as a patsy.
Right.
And truly a real patsy, a real, like, Oswald is just being Oswald until it's not even certain to us if he realized that he was, how badly he had been set up as a patsy, and what he would have been able to do after the fact if he had suddenly been able to tell all he knew, if anyone would have paid any attention to him, and it would have made any difference.
Yeah,
But
love William Kent's quote that Oswald was a useful idiot, and essentially that's what he was. Perfect patsy.
Do you think then that it wasn't an agency that placed him in the TSBD? Do you think this was
just a job?
Just a job, just the narrative.
And one of the reasons that makes me feel that way, I won't speak for David, is Oswald, we know Oswald tried to get a number of jobs that would have put him in downtown Dallas, on Main Street, on the route, aside from the school book depository. The FBI had to suppress all the leads they were given that he had applied for jobs all around downtown Dallas. The other thing that was suppressed is while he was working at the CSBD, he actually applied for a job elsewhere outside downtown Dallas. That was determined by local opera. He was continuing to look for jobs after he got the TSBD job, and had complained to both Ruth and Marina that it was just one more manual job, and if he would get out of there, he could as soon as he could.
Larry, what do you make of Pete Terry Bagley's comment to Malcolm Blunt, basically essentially stating that Oswald was a witting defector to the Soviet Union?
First of all, I'm not sure Bagley would have known what he was talking about. I mean, it's easy to speculate like that. If you look at the things Oswald said while he was, like, okay, he was a willing. I'm sorry, let me parse your language just a little bit, see if this works. He was a witting defector and a willing defector. He went to the Soviet Union. He wanted Russian citizenship. He told the Russians and told the Americans that he was disgusted with America. He was willing to share information that he had learned while he was in the service. I mean, he certainly was both a witting and willing defector. There's no doubt about that he was serious about that. And as a matter of fact, the longer he was there, the more he hung himself out. The one thing he didn't do, and the fascinating thing that didn't happen, is the Russians didn't respond to him at all. When we cover this in the book, there were lots of other defectors that the Russians put in front of Soviet media and made a big deal about. They were so unsure of Oswald that they didn't do that, despite the only statements he made against the U.S. were to American reporters, not to Pravda, which is insane in to one sense, and shows that they didn't understand what he was doing. They didn't trust him. Okay, we have to deal with this guy because he sounds, but no, now, having said all of that, and a point we make in the book, there is reason to suspect that Oswald, not when he was going, but when he was coming back, provided information to the U.S. Embassy in Moscow about things that he had learned and things that he had done in Russia, and that information went into intelligence collections, including the fact that he was most likely interrogated about the factory, and that showed up in intelligence collections. Oswald made an interesting remark on his way back while he was in his own notes, that he would never be used again. He would never allow anyone else to use him again for anything. And my suspicion is that had been part of the deal. The U.S. Embassy, the State Department, pushed back. They did not want him back. They pushed back over and over again in many ways to make it difficult for him to even do his paperwork. No, you can't write us. You've got to come to Moscow in person. You got to bring Marina in person. Yes, we know that's illegal and you don't have permission to do that. You got to do it anyway. They constantly push back against his reentry. And personally, I think he made a deal. He showed up there. He said, I am going to provide, okay, ask me questions that you want to ask me. I just need to get out of here. And I think that did happen. So from that perspective, you might also call him a witting source or a witting defector, because I think he did voluntarily provide some information. And we go over that process in the book.
Oswald on the in New Orleans, when he's on the radio debate, he slips up and says that when he was in Russia, he was under the protection of the American government.
And he was. He claimed that. As a matter of fact, he repeatedly asserted that in his communications to the State Department, that he was still an American citizen, that he had not renounced his citizenship, that they had to respond to them. That he repeated that over and over again in his letters to the embassy, that the embassy had a responsibility to him. And as a matter of fact, not just had a responsibility to them, they were required to help him get back to the U.S. and pay to help him get back to the U.S., which actually they did.
Yeah,
so I think that was absolutely true. And of course, in the radio interview, he wants to make himself look as good as possible, but that was a true statement.
I just feel like, obviously, when Oswald was going to renounce his citizenship, and he publicly, I suppose you could say publicly because it was bugged, told Richard Schneider that I was warned you would try and talk me out of it.
Yeah.
Which is obviously who they warned them.
Oh, I think, well, it's absolutely true. Remember, that was in Russia. Oswald had met in Helsinki, had to get permission to travel to Russia. He had already talked to the Russians. We have no idea what he told the Russians in Helsinki. He may have offered to share information there. And I have no doubt that, remember, when he got to Russia, he didn't go directly to the American embassy. He was in Russia for weeks trying to get permission to stay. And it was only when he had met with the Russians multiple times and been told that he could not stay. And by the way, he better leave. And he had a train ticket and he better be on it. He better be gone. They were not letting him stay. It was only at that time that he went to the American embassy. So he had lots of conversations before then. And again, I'm not going to assert that you can't read this both ways. It would be foolish. And I just think up to this point in time, everybody has read it one way and there is another way to read it. Then you get to take your choice.
So to conclude, Larry, is the working title of the book, The Fingerprints of Intelligence Are Not All Over Lee Harvey Oswald?
I say that again, I'm sorry, I didn't catch it.
So just to finish off, the working title of the book, is it that the fingerprints of intelligence are not all over Lee Harvey Oswald?
The working title, the title of the book is The Oswald Puzzle. In the book, we specifically assert that no, Oswald was not an intelligence agent, and we tackle those assertions head on. And here's why he does not appear to have been an intelligent asset in the Soviet Union, and here's why he does not appear to have been an intelligence asset or an FBI asset in New Orleans, and here's why he doesn't appear to have been one in Mexico City. And in all cases, we present the case for here is what real, known, documented intelligence assets did. Here's how the CIA really worked. Here's how the FBI really worked. Don't make up anything. We know what their practices were. That has been revealed. We have that history, and it does not match Lee Oswald.
Well, on that bombshell, Larry, I think we're going to have to close our weekend seminar. But I really do look forward to the book when it comes out. And thank you very much indeed.
Thanks, Larry.
It's always good to be back with you all.